The room didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet the way a fire goes out. One person stalking, then another. Then the whole boardroom held its breath. Isla Mercer, the 37-year-old chief operating officer of Vantage Publishing Group, stood at the head of the conference table with a leather portfolio in her hands and her eyes fixed on the man sitting 3 chairs down. The man who 48 hours ago had handed her divorce papers at her mother's graveside. The man who still did not know, had never known, that the company printing his name on a paycheck was hers. She set the portfolio down. She did not smile. She said, "Let's begin." 6 years earlier, Isla hadn't been anyone's idea of a publishing empire. She'd grown up in Clover, Tennessee, the kind of town with one stoplight and a diner that hadn't changed its menu since 1987. Her mother, Ruth Mercer, had run the local library for 31 years. Her father had left when Isla was 9 and never came back. What he left behind was a small inheritance from his own mother, enough for Ruth to put away in a savings account she never touched, money Isla didn't know about until she was 24, and Ruth handed her an envelope across the kitchen table. "Your grandmother wanted you to have something?" Ruth said. "Don't waste it on a man," Isla had laughed. Ruth had not. The envelope held $47,000. Isla spent 6 months doing nothing with it except thinking. She was working as an editorial assistant at a small Nashville imprint at the time, making $31,000 a year and eating a lot of rice and canned beans. She knew books. She knew what sold. She'd grown up in a library, catalogued everything, understood at a bone-deep level what stories made people feel less alone. She bought a 20% stake in a struggling online literary magazine called The Meridian with $12,000 of that money. The founder, an older woman named Estelle who was tired and ready to retire, sold her the rest 18 months later for almost nothing. Within 2 years, Isla had turned the Meridian's readership from 4,000 to 400,000. She licensed the brand. She launched a print quarterly. She sold advertising. She reinvested every dollar. By the time she was 30, she owned 3 imprints, a digital media platform, and a regional distribution network. By 33, Vantage Publishing Group had revenues north of $280 million annually and a roster of 41 New York Times bestsellers in 5 years. Nobody in the industry knew her face. That was intentional. Isla had watched enough public-facing executives get destroyed by the attention, the profiles, the panels, the profile pieces that always ended up being about how you looked or what you wore instead of what you built. She hired a public CEO to be the face of Vantage. She worked from a quiet office on the 4th floor of their Nashville headquarters and was listed in company documents as a senior strategic advisor. Her official title was COO. The real structure was known to 4 people: her attorneys, her CFO, and Estelle, who still sent her a card every Christmas. She met Donovan Hale at a charity gala for literacy programs in the fall of her 31st year. Donovan Hale, 38-year-old senior acquisitions editor at a boutique New York imprint, had a smile that arrived before the rest of him. He was the kind of man who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. Easy with people, quick with a compliment, remembered every name. Isla was not accustomed to being charmed. She was accustomed to being efficient. He brought her a glass of water she hadn't asked for, because he'd noticed she'd been holding an empty glass for 10 minutes while getting cornered by a distributor. That was the whole story of why she stayed. "You looked like you needed an exit strategy," he said. "I needed water," she said. He grinned. Even better, they talked for 2 hours. She told him she worked in publishing, which was true. She did not tell him what that meant. He told her about a manuscript he'd been fighting for, a debut novel by a teacher in rural Mississippi that every commercial publisher had passed on. He talked about it the way people talk about something they believe in, not the way people talk about something they want credit for. Isla noticed the difference. She called Estelle the next morning. "I met someone," she said. "Don't say anything." "I'm not saying anything," Estelle said. "Is he kind?" Isla thought about it. "He seems to be. That's the whole thing," Estelle said. "That's all it is." They dated for a year and a half. He moved from New York to Nashville for her, or so he said. He'd been let go from the boutique imprint in a round of cuts and framed the move as a fresh start. Isla helped him land a position at Vantage as a senior editor. She did it through proper channels, recusing herself from the hiring process, having her CFO handle it. The hiring manager didn't know Isla's relationship to Donovan. Donovan didn't know Isla's relationship to Vantage. She told herself this was clean. She told herself there was time to explain. They got married on a Saturday in April, small ceremony, Ruth crying happy in the front row. Isla wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. She kept telling herself there would be a right time to tell him. There wasn't, or she kept finding reasons why this particular moment wasn't it. He'd had a hard week. They were in a good place. She didn't want him to think she'd been strategic. She didn't want the dynamic to shift. She didn't want to see his face change the way faces change when they realize the math of a relationship isn't what they assumed, so she kept working in her quiet fourth-floor office. She kept being the CO. She kept coming home and asking about his day as if she hadn't already seen the acquisition reports. The first 3 years were good. Not perfect, no marriages, but genuinely good. Donovan was attentive. He brought coffee to bed on Sundays. He remembered things. When Ruth was diagnosed with early-stage heart disease, he drove to Clover with Isla every other weekend without being asked. He held Ruth's hand while she did her crossword puzzles. Isla loved him for that specifically, more than almost anything else. Then he got promoted. The promotion to editorial director came in the spring of his 4th year at Vantage. It was legitimate. He was good at his job. His team liked him. His acquisition track record was strong. Isla had genuinely stayed out of it. She found out the same day he did. From a congratulatory email, she was seed on as CO. She made reservations at his favorite restaurant. She bought a bottle of Barolo he'd been eyeing for months. She was happy for him. She was. Something changed after the promotion, and it changed slowly enough that Isla almost didn't notice it happening. He started working later. That was normal for the new role. He started taking calls in the car instead of in the house. Less normal, but explainable. He started coming to bed after she was asleep, and some mornings he was gone before she woke up. By itself, each thing was a small thing. Together, they built a shape she recognized from the outside but refused to name from the inside. She noticed a name in his phone. Not because she went looking, she would never go looking, but because his phone lit up on the kitchen counter one evening while he was in the shower, and the name was simply there. Paige. She looked at the notification long enough to read 7 words. Can't wait to see you this week. She put her own phone down. She turned the burner off under the pasta. She went and fed their dog, a 3-year-old golden retriever named Bo, who was waiting by his bowl with the same patience he always had, the same total faith that things would be as they should be. She stood there with the scoop in her hand and thought, I don't know yet. I don't know enough yet. She was not a woman who acted on 7 words. The Vantage building had a security system that logged every badge swipe, every elevator use, every access point. This was standard for a media company with intellectual property concerns. Isla had never thought much about it. She thought about it now. She didn't go looking herself. She asked Vantage's head of security, a former federal investigator named Gill, who had worked for the company for 11 years, to pull access logs for a specific floor, the floor where the editorial suites were, for the past 90 days. She gave him a business reason that was technically accurate. Gill delivered the report without comment. He was good at that. Donovan's badge had been used to access the executive floor, a floor above his own, on 14 separate evenings between 7 and 10 p.m. The executive floor housed, among other things, the private offices of senior leadership. It also housed a suite that Vantage kept for visiting executives, a comfortable room with a sitting area and a separate door. Paige Weston was a 29-year-old marketing coordinator who had joined Vantage 8 months ago. Her badge access had been used on the executive floor on the same 14 evenings. Isla read the report twice, sitting in her car in the parking garage. Then she drove home, made dinner, and asked Donovan how his day was. Long, he said. Good, but long. Bo missed you, she said. He scratched behind the dog's ears. I missed this guy too. She watched him do it and felt something close, like a door she'd been keeping open for a long time pulling gently shut. Ruth Mercer died on Tuesday in November, quietly, in her own bed, which was what she had wanted. Isla had been there. She'd been holding her mother's hand when it happened, and the room was very still, and outside the window the last of the season's leaves were coming down from the old oak that Ruth had planted the year Isla was born. Donovan arrived 2 hours later. He came in, held Isla, said the right things. She let herself be held. She was grateful for it. She didn't ask where he'd been. The funeral was on a Friday. Clover's Baptist Church was full. Ruth had known everyone, had helped everyone find something to read, had ordered books for children whose parents couldn't afford them, and never told anyone she'd paid for them herself. The minister spoke about the way Ruth treated every person who walked through the library door as if they were exactly the right person at exactly the right time. Isla sat in the front pew. Donovan sat beside her. The service ended. They walked out into the grey November light, and the small crowd moved toward the fellowship hall. Isla stopped at the bottom of the steps to speak to Ruth's oldest friend, a woman named Bertie who had known Ruth since they were girls. That was when Donovan touched her arm. Isla, he said. I need to give you something, she turned. He was holding an envelope. His face had that particular arrangement she'd seen on people before. The face of someone who has decided to do a thing and is now committed to doing it regardless of whether this is the right moment, which it was not, which he had to know. You're serving me papers at my mother's funeral, she said. It wasn't a question. It's better to be clean about it, he said. Bertie had gone quiet beside her. Isla looked at the envelope. She looked at him. She thought about the coffee he'd brought to bed on Sundays. She thought about him holding Ruth's hand over the crossword puzzle. She thought about 7 words on a lit-up phone screen. She thought about 14 evenings and a badge log and a room on a floor he had no business being on. She took the envelope. She put it in her coat pocket. She turned back to Bertie and said, "Tell me about the time you and my mother tried to drive to Nashville for a Dolly Parton concert." Bertie blinked, then Bertie laughed, watery and surprised, and she told the story. Donovan stood there for a moment, then he walked away. There are things people don't tell you about grief. One of them is that it does not pause for the other disasters in your life. Isla drove back to Nashville that weekend with her mother's pearl earrings in her pocket and a divorce petition in her coat, and Beau asleep across her lap in the passenger seat, which was not legal, but which she decided not to care about. She called her attorney from a rest stop off I-65. "He filed," she said. Her attorney, a precise woman named Sandra, who had handled Isla's business interests for 9 years, was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to respond now or wait?" "I want to respond now," Isla said, "but not the way he expects." Sandra understood, so always understood. What Donovan expected, presumably, was a straightforward dissolution, community property, a settlement negotiation, the split of a marriage that, on paper, belonged to 2 people with similar careers in the same industry. What Donovan did not know, and had never known, and was about to learn in a way that could not be managed or softened or handled in a quiet attorney's office, was that his wife owned the company he worked for, that his employment existed because of her, that his office, his title, his paycheck, the health insurance that covered the knee surgery he'd had 2 years ago, all of it traced back to Isla. Not because she'd arranged it, not as a trap, simply because that had always been the truth, and she had waited too long to say it, and now the waiting was over. The board meeting was scheduled for the 2nd Tuesday in December. It was a quarterly review, standard. 31 people in the Vantage boardroom on the 11th floor, including senior editors, department heads, and the public-facing CEO, a measured man named Arthur who had run the company externally for 6 years and knew exactly who Isla was. Donovan had been included in the meeting because editorial directors attended quarterly reviews. He didn't know Isla would be there. She rarely appeared in large meetings. She worked from the 4th floor and communicated through Arthur. She arrived 12 minutes early. She sat at the head of the table. When Donovan walked in at 3 minutes to the hour, he saw her and stopped in the doorway. His face did the thing faces do when the brain is trying to reconcile 2 things that don't fit together. He recovered quickly. He was good at that, and found a seat. Arthur opened the meeting. He gave his usual brief remarks. Then he said, "Before we move into the quarterly numbers, I want to take a moment to formally introduce a few of our senior leadership team members to some of our newer directors." He paused. "Isla, would you like to say a few words?" Isla stood. She had a leather portfolio in her hands. Because she always had a leather portfolio in her hands, she set it on the table. She looked around the room, at the department heads she'd hired, at the editors she'd greenlit, at the walls of the company she had built from $12,000 and her grandmother's belief in her. She looked at Donovan last. "My name is Isla Mercer," she said. "I'm the founder and principal owner of Vantage Publishing Group. I've served as COO for the past several years in an operational capacity, but the ownership structure of this company has always rested with me. I wanted to take a moment to be clear about that, particularly given some personal circumstances that may affect certain employment arrangements going forward." She watched his face. She watched it carefully, the way you watch something you've been waiting a long time to stop watching. He had gone very still. "Arthur will walk us through the Q4 numbers," she said. "I'll be available for any questions afterward." She sat down. The room resumed. Arthur began talking about revenue figures. The department heads opened their folders. Someone poured water from the pitcher in the middle of the table. The meeting continued the way meetings continue, because work continues, because the world does not stop moving to accommodate the private catastrophes of the people inside it. Donovan did not speak for the remainder of the meeting. He came to find her afterward. She'd expected that. She was in the corridor outside the boardroom, speaking with the CFO about a distribution contract, and she saw him waiting, standing slightly apart from the others filtering out, his portfolio under his arm, his jaw set in the way it set when he was trying to control something. The CFO excused himself. Donovan said, "How long?" "Since before I met you," she said. "You knew when you got me hired here. You got yourself hired here. I recused from the process, but you knew." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. There was anger in it, which she'd expected. There was also something else, something quieter and harder to look at. She thought it might be shame. She thought he might be doing the arithmetic of the past 4 years and arriving at uncomfortable answers about what he'd assumed and why he'd assumed it. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "I was going to," she said, "and then I kept not doing it, and then I found out about Paige, and then my mother died, and then you handed me an envelope at her funeral." She paused. So, he didn't have an answer to that, or he had one, but he couldn't make it reach the surface. "The divorce will proceed," she said. "Sandra will be in touch with your attorney about the terms. Given the circumstances, I think we both know how that's going to go." "Isla, I'm not angry at you," she said, which was almost true. "I'm just done." She picked up her portfolio. She walked back toward the elevator. Bo was at home waiting by the front door the way he always waited, tail going before she'd even turned the key. She knelt down in the entryway and let him put both paws on her shoulders, which he wasn't supposed to do and which she allowed anyway, and she stayed like that for a minute, with her face against his warm, ridiculous neck. She thought about Ruth handing her an envelope across a kitchen table. She thought about 31 years of a woman ordering books for children who couldn't afford them and never telling anyone. She thought, "I am my mother's daughter after all." She stood up. She turned on the kitchen light. She fed Bo his dinner, measured portions, same as every evening, and then she went to her desk and opened her laptop and began reading the Q4 report she'd already memorized, because the work was still there, and the work had always been hers, and there was something clarifying about returning to a thing that had never once let her down. Outside, the December dark had settled fully over Nashville. Inside, the light was on. The dog was eating. The numbers on the screen were good. Isla Mercer turned a page and kept going.